Well, hello. I'm Jennifer Ohman-Rodriguez. I'm the curator of trauma recovery at Compassionate Christianity. And I'm here today with Dr. Beverly Wallace of Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Wallace is an associate professor of congregational and community care. She is also an ordained pastor with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And she also holds a PhD in family social science with an emphasis on marriage and family therapy. She is the author of, or co-author of, African American Grief. And in the aftermath of Katrina, she was the assistant to the bishop of the Southeastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and she was headed up the recovery efforts for that crisis. So welcome today, Dr. Wallace. Thank you for this gift of your time and your expertise. And I am so excited to hear just what you have to say about trauma recovery in general and in leading into this time that we're all living in that includes trauma. So I was reading one of your articles in the Living Lutheran. I believe the title is What's in a Name? And you mentioned this concept of soul trauma. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that for us.
Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity to be interviewed and to help me remember some of the things that I have wrestled with. I have been teaching pastoral care and counseling for the last 7 years or so, and primarily with my students being African American. And so when I teach pastoral care, when I was teaching there, particularly in historical Black theological institutions, we talked about the soul and an understanding of the soul and reclaiming a new understanding of the soul, where I suggest that that it's not that we have a soul, but we are a soul. And so with that, and with that African understanding, there are parts of the soul that has been fragmented because of issues of trauma, being that of historical trauma with the Great Maafa, with that of everyday trauma of trying to live in the American context. And then with my experience with Katrina, the traumas that come with disaster. And so that's part of the grounding for my thinking around soul trauma. Parts of us have been broken. And then the question is, how then do we begin the work of healing? And so my focus, again, is on the healing work. How then do we first recognize that we've been traumatized in the various ways we've been traumatized, and then how then do we begin the work of healing work, which is one of the classical functions of pastoral care, that of healing. So again, that's the premise for my work.
Well, thank you. I love that we are a soul, not that we have a soul. I love that concept. That just expanded my whole thinking about trauma right there. So thinking about soul trauma, let's just piggyback off that. Like in these months and weeks and days that we're living right now, and if how is trauma impacting all of us then? Given that, like, from a clinical standpoint, anything that feels life-threatening to us causes our body to be in a trauma mode. Right.
Yeah, we respond. We flee or we freeze, and sometimes we just get stuck. We can't respond, and especially if it's sudden and unexpected, what does one do? Typically, we don't think about our living. We just go about our daily lives. But then when something traumatic such as this pandemic occurs, when every part of our life has been turned upside down, we try to figure out how then do we get out of that situation. Sometimes we get stuck and there's nothing that we can do. We get paralyzed in our inactivity, or we try to find a way out of that, trying to get to a normal state, which is often uncomfortable, especially when that force is coming from the outside. We had no control over this pandemic. And so how then do we resolve the feelings, the emotions around the experiences of not being in control? One of my professors, when I was doing my PhD work, she talked about and she wrote about ambiguous loss, and the idea that we don't have control over situations, and we want closure. And if we can't have closure, then what do? And we get stuck in the paralysis of not knowing how to grieve those losses that we're experiencing, those losses that we call ambiguous, those losses that we can't make any meaning out of it. We can't find a resolution and a closure. For some of us, trauma is like that, where we have no control over certain situations in our life. For some, we thought we had control over those situations. And with this pandemic, realizing, oh, we have no control over this. What do we do? And I think that's where we are right now. We're trying to find solutions for a time that is so ambiguous, so out of our control, and we respond in particular ways.
Yeah, this whole concept of ambiguous loss attributed to this time, that's very helpful because there is no end date.
Exactly.
Or the end date keeps moving. Like in Minnesota recently, your stay-at-home order is extended. But also like where the peak curves, these keep changing. So even this term, ambiguous loss, I think this is an important one for us to hold close. That there's the firm foundation is not under our feet at the moment.
No.
So how would you advise pastoral leadership to speak into this and pray into this with the people that they serve?
I think one of the things that we need to do, and I think that for many of us, we did this on Saturday, right after Good Friday, to be still. To be still and to feel the emotions of the moment, to honor those emotions of the loss. With Good Friday, with the death. So a death of a reality as we knew it. What do we do with that? How do we grieve that? Or do we rush to the resurrection? A new beginning. Can we be still and sit with those emotions and honor those emotions that are so human? Jesus is human, so human. There was a loss and we couldn't make sense out of it. We tried to make sense out of it. We continuously tried to make sense out of it. How then do we sit and be with those feelings? Even going back to taking the time to remember what happened in the past. Take from the past, those learnings from the past. There was a pandemic 100 years ago. What happened then? how do we survive? We survived. Yes, there are losses of life, but we also survived. And so what can you learn from the past that you can bring into the present so that you can, I'm not going to say try to make sense of it, but find some way of being with the, I want to say uncertainty of life. We think it's so certain. Life is not certain. And so to be able to, I would say that pastors and leaders need to recognize their humanity, and that, and this is what I say in my class, we have a Savior and it's not us. And so how then do we walk with the idea that we don't have all the answers. We can't make things better unless we sit with God's people.
Which is, it's an interesting time to sit and be still.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not something we can so easily do together.
Mm-hmm.
Many of us are trying to do that in isolation. But I'm wondering, like, how creatively we could sit together as communities in Christ and be still.
Yeah.
Like in a platform like this.
Right. And that's, I mean, and I think that's what's happening. We're finding new and creative ways to be with one another. I remember going to a birthday party with my daughter, and she's sitting there on her phone communicating with someone that's sitting right next to her. On the phone, and they're on the phone. It's like, how then do you be in relationship with another? Well, we're having to find new ways to do that using this platform, so the worship services that's happened, finding new ways of doing that, finding ways of being with our family, and honoring those precious moments that we've taken for granted. We're so busy, society is so busy that we have not taken time to be creative in our relationship and our engagement with one another. It's wide open. There's a variety of ways that we can muster up new ideas about how to be with each other.
Yes, and what if in that stillness, for people watching this interview, this video, past trauma comes up? Because in our busyness, we often mask trauma that has a need to be healed.
Right. And I think part of it is, again, going back to the need to be relational, to be in relationship with someone, and someone that you can trust. One of my colleagues, constantly said, you need to have a community that can hold your pain. And so how then do you find, and it's not easy because, again, we're so used to being our own individualistic not being in a relationship, not even talking about the pains that we are, everything's okay, everything's fine, just say hello, everything's fine. But now, and it is difficult, I would say that, especially if you've not been in a relationship with someone who can hold your pain and who can hold your truth. And to be able to find someone to be with, to hold you, even as you might relive some of the pain of a traumatic experience you've had in the past.
Yes, what I'm noticing myself, and I'm in seminary, that I'm being approached to be the holder of people's pain. and I've had to stand back and say, God,
Mm-hmm.
I'm being called to do something here.
Mm-hmm.
And please walk with me, because this is new.
Mm-hmm.
I'm used to, in the last 3.5 years, asking other people to hold my pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a real shift
Mm-hmm.
in my experience of life.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting there is pastors who aren't done holding their own pain enough
Right.
to hold other people's pain right now.
Right. Right. Yes, that's true. And that's why I tell my students, you need a spiritual director and you need a therapist. You've got to do your work. And oftentimes we don't want to do that work because it's hard work. We're so busy wanting to solve the hurt of somebody else that we have not taken time to look at our own hurt. I just posted a lecture about one of the normative tasks of pastoral care, doing the theological reflection, but also looking at oneself and one's embedded theologies, as well as engaging in what I'm proposing that we do, engage in intercultural pastoral care, meaning I'm 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 honoring you. I'm honoring you and all that you bring. And at the same time, I'm honoring me by looking at myself and not seeing that I'm the expert as a pastor, but I am walking with, not for, but walking with someone as they try to navigate their life. Because the other person is an expert in their own, their experience is their experience. We're not an expert in their lives. And so how then do we walk with someone? But as you said, oftentimes we're not taught to look at ourselves. We don't want to do CPE, clinical pastoral education, to really do the hard work so that we can more effectively, for lack of a better word, walk with someone in their lived experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, thank you for even putting out there that we need to continue, we need to do the work, and we need to continue to do the work as pastoral leaders. That's part of the job.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 Especially if you want to really affect change. And so one of the questions I raised in my class today is, who needs to be changed? What needs to be changed? Is it just the individual who's the care seeker, or is it the caregiver as well as the care seeker? And I'm proposing that it's both. We're changed by our interactions with other people. And so I learn more about myself when I'm engaging with you, and you learn about yourself while you're engaging with me. But one has to be open to the wanting and the curiosity, not out of being nosy, but out of the curiosity about the wonderment of this wonderful person that God has created. Who is she? What is she about? I want to know her. I want to know him. How then do I do that if I'm not vulnerable myself and being open to one, listening, and then doing the reflective work that's necessary.
Well, it seems like this time is a time for deep reflection for everyone. What are some ways that you are suggesting to students or other pastors or faculty members even about reflecting right now?
Take their Sabbath.
Mm.
We're in a culture where we have to produce, or we feel like we have to produce. To what end? I mean, hopefully there is an end, but what about taking a Sabbath? I mean, truly taking a Sabbath where one can be still. I've decided myself, here at Luther, we were off on Wednesday through yesterday as our spring break Holy Week. I decided not to look at any emails, not to do any Zoom calls, not to do anything until today. Or actually, I started last night when I prepared for my lecture for today. But taking that time, really cherishing the moments, looking to see all of creation, looking at this outside, whether it's snowing in Minnesota or if, the pollen on the cars here in North Carolina, the wonders of God's creation. Take the time. We don't know what tomorrow is going to be like. We can't control that part of our being. Even if we try or even move toward that, one never knows what's going to happen. So taking the time to embrace life and to live it.
Well, that's good advice, and one I need to take more seriously during this time. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What else is on your heart, Dr. Wallace, about trauma, especially during this time? I mean, are you seeing, are there patterns that look familiar to you, or especially patterns that aren't healthy?
Well, one unhealthy pattern that I've developed is eating too much. So that means that I'm going to have to check out, what is that about? And I know part of that is my mom was in a nursing home up until the beginning of this pandemic when I came here from Luther to visit her. And when they told me that I would not be able to go to see her, nor would her caregivers be able to go back into the place, I brought her home. I brought her back home. And not only is she living better, eating better, she's thriving. For the first time today, she's out of bed. And it's wonderful to have that. So paying attention to our elders is something that I would love for us to consider. I'm seeing so many of our care facilities are, the virus has hit and killed many of our elderly members of our communities. Raising what I call the Marvin Gaye question: what is going on? What is occurring that we've not paid attention to? So again, taking the time to explore how other people, not just me, but other people are impacted by this pandemic is something I think that, in the immediacy of this, we want to, survive. But then as we're settling into this new pattern of being, what else do we need to consider? Who else do we need to consider? I heard one of the congresspersons said that elderlies would be more than happy to die for the economy. Really? Seriously? No, I don't think so. So again, recognizing the preciousness of life in every breath that we take. This virus is affecting our breathing. Can we appreciate every breath that we take? It is a gift. How then do we recognize the gift of the breath of oneself as well as the gift of the breath of another?
And that breath is Holy Spirit.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Thank you. Making that connection. hmm
Right. Every
Yes.
time I tend to hold my breath when I'm stressed and as a trauma response. And every time I
Mm-hmm.
breathe right now, I think, okay, the
Mm-hmm.
spirit is in me.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
just like a prayer and a reminder.
Yes.
And, and,
Yes.
and our
I
older,
like that. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
you're welcome. I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
our older precious loved ones and people everywhere are breathing
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
care facilities or at home or wherever. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, they are very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
So
uh,
how do we care for their soul?
mm,
Going back to the original question of soul trauma, how do we care for their soul? What are the traumatic experiences that they've occurred, and how then do we embrace them, hold them, help them breathe a little bit? How, yeah, you know, until that last breath um, leaves them. Mm, yeah,
and all this is sacred.
absolutely,
This is
absolutely.
sacred time. And when
Mm-hmm.
people pass to what comes next and we
Mm-hmm.
don't hold it up as sacred,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which it seems to be happening some places now.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but I think the trauma on the family that is left and the friends that are left, uh,
Mm-hmm.
this is deeply disturbing.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is because it's th- no, I believe in systems theory, and so what are those forces that are in play that makes this even more traumatic? Those cultural forces, what's happening with the and societal forces, what's happening with the medical system, what's happening with we can even go back to historical trauma, what occurred that makes this even more um, um, insidious.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
yeah,
Because
and
our most vulnerable people
mm-hmm,
are the ones most likely to be sick and the most likely to die.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. I was going to go someplace else with this, but I forgot where I was going.
It's
Okay.
okay. I'm sorry.
No, no. No, even before that. So you helped me with that piece.
Yeah, so I'm also
The,
wondering a bit
mm-hmm,
about, I've been thinking about this for myself, that I think there's some moral injury in all of this for us.
mm-hmm,
And not just
mm-hmm,
for definitely for medical people, but I wonder even about myself,
mm, yeah.
like when I go out to go to
Yes.
the grocery store and I might
Right.
be a carrier,
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. And so then understanding um, our responsibility
Mhm.
with the privilege that we have, how then do we monitor that or even honor the fact that, and honor in a way that's not, um, we're not being, we're not boasting about our privilege, but honoring, wow, I have I have the privilege of staying home. I have the privilege of bringing my mom home. I have that privilege to to have a place to stay that I don't have to worry about paying humongous mortgage. I have those privileges. Um, and so then what is my calling and maybe even my responsibility, not necessarily because I have to gain, some brownie points with God, but then what is my responsibility to my neighbor in this time. I know one of the things that's happening here in this area, and it's a rural area that I'm living in with my mom right now. The children are not in school, of course, and so they don't have food for lunch where they would get it in the school. Well, the center, there's a community center that interestingly is named after my mother. And so they're providing food. And so supporting them in that way so that the children in the community can eat. It's a privilege to be able to be able to support them in that work. I know where I was going. I was thinking about death. So I do a lot of work in writings around death. And so the fear of death, I think that's part of the traumatic experience. That complicates the traumatic experience too because of our fear of death. Part of it is our fear of living. How then do we live? Knowing that death is part of the cycle of life. And so one of the things I think that we might need to reclaim are some of the ancestral understandings of death and what does that mean so that we can be a little less traumatized when there's death. And I'm not discounting the traumatic death experiences that's culminated, that came about because of the pandemic, but understanding of death is something I think that we might want to really rethink as well. What does that mean? What does it mean to have that full circle of life where death is a part of that? And then also with death, how do you live? So that's where I was going. I thought about that.
Yeah, can you just talk a little bit more about traditional or ancestral ways of viewing death?
Again, recognizing it's the full circle. It's not an end, but there's a transition. We say that when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus the Christ, that death does not have the last word. And so if there's a belief system that we believe in the resurrection, if we believe that the spirit within continues to live on even after the body decays, can we see death in a new and different way? Where, yes, we mourn and we grieve the fact that the person that we love is no longer here, but we can also celebrate in the fact that that this person did live and impact our lives and in a particular way, that we can continue to go on and their spirit continues to live on even after their body is gone.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's what's hard to remember when people are alone without their family in a hospital struggling.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? That they're not alone. First of all, God's with them. But also if they do die, they still live within us.
Yeah. And again, it's the complication of the traumatic experience where we've cut off an important part of that death ritual, being with someone at the end of their life, where, you and I can't go visit them. We can't sit with them. We can't hold their hands. When my brother passed away in 2015, I was there, I closed his eyes, and doing those parts that for some it's scary, but for some it's a gift of being with them at that point in their life trajectory. And again, it goes back to trauma. What is trauma? What makes something traumatic? Oftentimes it's the suddenness of it. It's the unexpectedness of it. the intensity of the situation. And that's why this period is so difficult, because it is a major disruption in our way of being and living and even dying.
Right. It's a disruption, it's a dislocation, and like we said earlier, you said ambiguous. We don't know when it ends.
Right. Right.
And I'm wondering what the parallel with that is with, people who are living with constant abuse, when you don't know when the abuse will end.
Right. And so that's how we constantly react to the not knowing. And so we're constantly on edge, because we don't know, well, if I say something, will that spark a batterer to abuse me? If I look the wrong way, will that, because of, again, the ambiguity of that. That's interesting, because I'm getting ready to teach a course on domestic violence this summer, and thinking about that, how does ambiguity in that situation relate? Because again, in this period of time too, a lot of persons who have been abused, they're stuck in the home with their abuser. So what do we do? So the ramification of this is tremendous. And we're going to see it in our churches. When this period is over, how then do pastors and congregational leaders and individuals in the congregation respond to the effects, the impact of this, including persons in the congregation who've been in abusive situations and then coming to church afterwards? How do we respond? Unfortunately, lots to learn about, learn from this experience. I'll put it that way. There's lots to learn and to consider.
Yes, and I'm wondering if this is a great time for pastors to be thinking about becoming more trauma informed.
Yes.
So that when we do come back together, people aren't re-traumatized in the pew.
Right.
Or, and things like that. Like, how do we preach into that? Making sure that we're holding so dear people's experiences. I have been thinking about that.
And one of the lectures that I do, I've not done it here at Luther, but to talk about worship as pastoral care. And so if we embrace worship and even the preaching moment as opportunities to provide pastoral care, and then also to hone up our skills, or hone up what I call our fund of meaning, with understanding of trauma, understanding about domestic violence, understanding those specific lived experiences of individuals, we can preach better, we can teach better, we can respond better, recognizing that, again, the preaching moment is, yes, it's a preaching moment, but after 15 minutes or 30 minutes, there's still that person in the pew who's going to go home or be in the community that's dealing with life situations that we need to pay attention to. We do need to pay attention to it.
Well, Dr. Wallace, we're running out of time, but this has been so wonderful. Thank you. This has been such a gift for me personally, and anyone who will tune into this video. Thank you for your expertise and your work in trauma, and your ongoing thinking about this time that we're living in. And you're a blessing to us all and to the church. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate this. Take care. Bye-bye now.